Good afternoon, gentlemen. Please sit down. Gentlemen, as has already been announced, the Supreme Military Council met yesterday and after an exhaustive deliberation approved your appointments as military governors for the 19 states of the Federation.
Only a year after coming to power, Buhari's honeymoon period was over. The economy languished under the pressure of crushing external debt, unemployment and inflation still soared despite tough austerity measures, and the military was becoming increasingly authoritarian when dealing with its opponents. Policies that had been popular when first implemented were being retrospectively reinterpreted in negative terms. During his speech at an agricultural conference in Ibadan, former head of state General Obasanjo warned against sectional domination and argued for a reconsideration of the War Against Indiscipline (WAI) campaign, which he said must go beyond singing the national anthem and reciting the national pledge. The WAI became characterized by the concerted efforts of various citizens to circumvent it, and its implementation was complicated by timing and circumstances. It urged discipline, sanitation, and the demolition of shack stores that were erected by lower-income traders anxious to supplement their declining incomes at a time of great economic depression. The environmental sanitation message inherent in WAI antagonized petty traders, roadside mechanics, and hawkers whose stores were often demolished as eyesores. The seeds of confrontation between soldiers and journalists were sown long before the military's return to power in 1984. The press had a field day under the civilian government of President Shagari. Freed by the absence of criticism-sensitive soldiers in government, the press launched constant vitriolic attacks against public officials and often published articles that would not have been tolerated even in the most liberal Western democracy. Some journalists interpreted the phrase "freedom of the press" as a carte blanche license to publish personally abusive articles against the public officials. A few journalists were charged with sedition, inciting rebellion against the government. Some newspapers were owned and/or financed by powerful political oligarchs and served merely as mouthpieces for the advancement of their benefactors' political platform or viewpoints. The incoming military government was concerned about the role of the press in degrading the Shagari government and wished to avoid falling into the same pitfall. It was against this backdrop that the federal military government enacted the Public Officers Decree 4. This decree made it a criminal offense to publish any article that was false or which, even if true, brought or was calculated to bring the federal military government, any state government, or any public officer into ridicule or disrepute. Tunde Thomas and Nduka Rabo of the Guardian newspapers were unfortunate to fall foul of the Decree 4. They were brought before a tribunal on June 4, 1984 and tried for publishing an article discussing the posting of various military officers to diplomatic positions abroad. They were convicted and sentenced to a year in prison, even though the article was true and accurate in almost all respects. Decree 4 alienated the press and made it hostile to the Buhari regime. The imprisonment of their members not only made the press criticize Decree 4, but it incentivized them to dig for other shortcomings of the Buhari regime. Decree 4 was not the only controversial measure. Decree 2 of 1984, the State Security Detention of Persons Decree, also proved unpopular. It empowered the federal military government to detain any person considered by Tunde Idiagbon, the Chief of Staff, Supreme Headquarters, to be a security threat for up to 3 months without charge or trial. The 3-month term could be renewed on its expiry if Idiagbon was satisfied that the detainee remained a security risk. Although it caused much antagonism and controversy, the decree had actually been on the statute book of Nigerian military regimes since 1966, having originally been enacted by the first military government of Major General Aguiyi Ironsi. However, the decree had been used sparingly and only came to public attention during the Buhari regime due to its liberal use of the decree to detain its opponents and critics such as Tai Solarin, Beko Ransom Kuti, and Harun Adamu. The federal military government seemed to be responding to every crisis with force and confrontation. It reacted to a dispute with the Nigerian Medical Association and National Association of Resident Doctors by proscribing both organizations. Despite considerable experience of military rule, the Nigerian consensus was that the government by soldiers was an aberration. The expectation remained that military should be limited to temporary and corrective caretaker governments. Although perceived as providing stability and order through authoritarian rule, Nigerian military regimes have an inbuilt weakness. As Nigeria lacks an effective nationwide civilian-led opposition, civilians cannot realistically force military governments out of power. Therefore, a military government can be replaced only with its consent or by a revolt from within by another military faction. Although Nigerians welcomed the coup that brought Buhari to power, this was predicated on the basis that once in power, the military's role was to conduct short-term reform, then promptly return to the barracks and restore the status quo of civilian rule. Perpetual military rule was undesirable to Nigerians, even if a particular regime was popular. The Murtala Obasanjo regime of 1975 to 1979 retained enduring popularity because it combined reformist government with a political transition to democracy. In contrast, the Buhari regime made a serious political miscalculation by declining to reveal a program or timetable for the return of democracy. He stated that it could not prioritize a return to civilian rule as it was too focused on tackling the political and economic crisis it inherited. Buhari rhetorically asked, "Is it not more profitable to devote our time to the task of restoring sanity to our society and making life more tolerable for our people than to the academic exercise of drawing up a timetable for the return of power to those who have only recently brought us to this economic and social precipice?" This made the leadership appear myopic and politically directionless. The ethnic and religious composition of Buhari's SMC also concerned Southerners. Although the SMC's membership was increased to 21, virtually all of its senior positions were held by Northern Muslims. Only 8 SMC members were from the South. Additionally, there had always been an unwritten rule that the Nigerian head of state and his deputy could not be from the same religion or geographic region. Tradition has always mandated the North-South splits between the two most senior posts. The Buhari regime broke this unwritten rule with the appointment of Tunde Idiagbon as the regime's number 2. Although Tunde Idiagbon is a Yoruba name, he was from Ilorin, adjacent to the north, and was also a Muslim. 6 of the 8 most powerful figures in the Buhari regime were Muslims, that is, Buhari, head of state, Idiagbon, chief of staff, Supreme Headquarters, Babangida, chief of army staff, Rafin Dadi, director general of the NSO, Maguru, minister of internal affairs, and Vatsa, minister of the Federal Capital Territory. The most prominent Christian in the SMC was Major General Bali, defense minister. Even then, Bali was a Tarok from the Middle Belt. Additionally, only one Brigadier Oni of the 4 GOCs was Southern, meaning that 4 of the 5 most senior army positions were also held by Northern Muslims. The loop-sided ethno-religious composition of the SMC, coupled with the fact that Buhari's ascension to power preempted the zoning of the presidency to the south, prompted some Southerners to claim that the New Year's Eve coup was a deliberate plan to prevent a Southerner from being elected president at the next election. Conspiratorial minds in the South began interpreting the coup as an orchestrated preservation of the North's control of Nigeria by transferring power from Northern civilians to Northern soldiers. However, logic suggests that the major motivating role for the 1983 coup was the personal ambition of its primary actors rather than any Machiavellian plots to thwart the South. The federal military government also announced a harsh crackdown on drug dealing. It enacted Decree 20, which prescribed the death penalty for convicted drug dealers. The decree had retroactive effects. 3 convicted drug dealers named Lawal Olujokwe, Bartholomew Owo, and Bernard Ogedengbe were sentenced to death and executed by a firing squad on April 14, 1985. The executions caused much soul-searching and made the federal military government seem harsh for approving the execution of drug dealers who committed offenses before the death penalty became applicable to their offense. Undeterred, a few weeks later, the Supreme Military Council approved the execution of 3 more drug dealers, including Mrs. Gladys Iyama, a mother of 2 paraplegic children. She was the first woman in Nigerian history to be executed by a firing squad. Conscious of the brutality of publicly executing a woman, the federal military government authorized her execution in private at the Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Lagos. However, the sentence was never carried out. Iyama was not the only woman linked to drug dealing. Another woman named Gloria Okon was arrested in 1985 at the Aminu Kano International Airport in Kano in possession of several kilograms of cocaine. She was trying to board a flight to Europe. After being arrested, Okon mysteriously died a few days later in custody. Buhari appointed a judicial commission of inquiry chaired by Judge Canis Ubunonu to investigate her death, but Buhari was overthrown before the judicial commission could submit its reports. The report was eventually submitted to Buhari's successor, Ibrahim Babangida, in September 1985, but its findings remain unknown. Buhari's tough stance on crime and corruption and use of the death sentence for convicted drug traffickers endangered members of the elites who were involved in his practices. He had already imprisoned several prominent members of the political elite, and his uncompromising stance on corruption was threatening the future economic livelihood of corrupt military, businesses, and political elites who had not yet been incarcerated. A split opened in the Supreme Military Council with Buhari, Idiagbon, Magoro, and Rafindadi on one side, and Babangida heading the opposition. The cleavage was excavated by policy difference between Babangida and the duo of Buhari and Idiagbon. Babangida opposed Decree 4, the long jail terms being given to politicians, and Buhari's approach to negotiations with international lending institutions. Defense Minister Domkat Bali also recalled getting into a verbal altercation with Idiagbon during an SMC meeting. Bali felt that the 22-year jail sentence handed down to UPN Governor Bisi Onabanjo was unduly harsh, given that he was convicted not of enriching himself, but of paying kickbacks from contracts into his party's bank accounts. Bali felt that 22 years was too harsh for such an offense and would complicate matters when more serious cases of corruption emerged. Idiagbon disagreed and replied that some SMC members were being unduly sympathetic to the politicians. The pivotal point that pushed the tension between Buhari and Babangida into overt confrontation was Buhari's investigation into the financial irregularities at the Ministry of Defense. The investigation threatened Babangida directly, as he had been working at Army headquarters in the previous years, firstly as the Director of Army Staff Duties and Plans, and currently as the Chief of Army Staff. These investigations led to the discovery of suspicious financial disbursements and alleged racketeering by Babangida's close ally, Colonel Aliyu Muhammad. Muhammad's explanation, which were corroborated by Babangida, that the disbursements were used to fund the coup that brought Buhari to power were not accepted, and Buhari retired Muhammad. Babangida also claimed that the NSO was monitoring the activities of SMC members and had even bugged his own telephone lines. Major General Bali later claimed that Babangida and Abacha were really very frightened under Buhari. Nobody knew the reason, but they were really hysterically jittery and desperate. By not presenting a timetable for the restoration of democracy, attempting to muzzle the press, and having no solution to worsening economic conditions, Buhari and Idiagbon played into the hands of conspirators within the military. Buhari compounded his problems by not rewarding the key junior and mid-ranking officers who staged the coup that brought him into power with lucrative political postings. This created discontent among officers who were essentially coup specialists. Other officers in the government and junior officers took their complaints to Babangida. Babangida later admitted that he opportunistically took advantage of the turning of the political tide against Buhari. There was a lot going in our favor, so we seized the moment. You see, we are very smart people. We don't intervene when we know the climate is not good for it, or the public will not welcome it. We wait until there's a frustration in society. In all the coups, you find there has always been one frustration or the other. Anytime there's frustration, we step in. And then there is demonstration welcoming the redeemers.